Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review is brought to you in part by Rogers Hobby Center in Saginaw, Michigan, where the fun begins.
This review covers the 27 Street Rod. It's a 125 scale kit from Revell, number 7238. Now, the Ford Model T was generally known as the automobile that allowed the mass public, the middle class, to afford a car. And it really changed life here. Now, the Model T needed a styling change by 1926. And this design had a nice difference on the appearance of the car and kind of paved the way for the Model A. Now, the predecessors to the Hot Rod were modified cars that were used in Prohibition in the South by bootleggers, mostly to evade the revenue agents and get away from the cops. But hot rods, they pretty much first appeared in the 30s in Southern California, where people raced some modified cars on the dry lake beds around LA. This gained popularity big time after World War II, when the soldiers were coming back, in California especially, because they had some technical training. Now, the first rods were old cars, the old Ford Model Ts and As and Bs, and they were modified to reduce their weight, and quite often had a bigger engine installed for speed. Now, typically, they would take off the parts, the hoods, the bumpers, pretty much anything, channel the body, etc., to give it that speed and weight ratio. Now, the wheels and tires were also often changed to improve traction and handling. And before 45, mostly there were wire spoke wheels. But still, it's a popular hobby today. Hot rodding is still going strong, but the old cars are getting expensive, and quite often you'll find fabricated frames and body parts, mostly on the new hot rods. Now, this Revell kit was first produced in '75. And got a new boxing in '76 and '82 and also in '87. This one is the 1982 release, and it has 106 parts, molded in orange, smoked clear, black rubber tires, and chrome plate. It also includes a small sheet of water slide decals, and when it's finished, it's about 5.5 inches long, 2 3/4 inches wide, and 3 inches tall. I think I hear Newt. He's the program director, and apparently he's got a question. Come in here, Newt. What is it?
That is pretty cool for an old car design. Can it go fast as well?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Some of these old Fords were fitted with flatheads in the early days, but after that they started dropping modern V8s into them. You can get a lot of horsepower out of a 327 Corvette engine. But anyway, one of the more surprising things is how they handle. They're very nimble. They almost drive like a foreign sports car, those small ones, a little MGB or even a go-kart type of handling. So with some nice tires and a driveline that can handle a V8, they're pretty impressive, really. Here are the parts for the kit. As you can see, the nice smoked glass there at the bottom. The chrome is still in good shape for a 1982 release. And one other thing you'll notice, it's molded in orange, so you'll need to prime that well. Also, the tires come in halves. You have to glue those tire halves together. That's the old style of tire manufacturing. Now, watch to make sure that you heed the manufacturer's safety and use guidelines for any of the products that you see or hear used in the review. Here are the decals for the kit. They're fairly basic, but they've got some complementary stripes if you stick with certain types of colors. Your yellows, your oranges, etc. Even white might work. But you'll need some setting solution to get around some of the compound curves and things, and they went on pretty well despite being that old. Sometimes you need to spray these with a little bit of fixative and then cut them out separately, but these went on, and there was just one issue we'll talk about later. Construction starts with the frame, and so grab these pieces, and then also there's some cross members that will mount. Now glue the two halves of the frame together, and there's no positive alignment points, so Quickly I glued all the cross members to the frame while everything was still movable with some tube cement. Now before it dries, make sure everything is square and flat as you can make it, so that all the tires touch the ground and the body sets on it evenly. And now we can work with the engine. You can see the parts that you'll need here. So get those out of the kit and remove any imperfections and any flash. And then glue the engine halves together and the water pump to the front of that and the oil filter on the other side. Now glue the plate and the starter to the bell housing and glue that assembly to the engine. Finally, add the transmission halves, put those together and glue them to the bell housing. Next step, we'll gather up the parts for the rear differential housing, and remember that you have to scrape chrome plating and paint for that matter from any of the surfaces you want to glue together. And now you'll see here that part of the differential is painted a black. Now I use a product called Stenolres primer, and it has a little bit of a sheen. It's almost a semi-gloss, but it's a good primer, and I used that at this time for a lot of parts and painted them all in the kit for the engine, the frame, the chassis, the engine bay, and even the interior parts. Now at this point, glue the differential halves together around the rear axle, but don't get glue on the axle if you want the tires to spin, and then glue the brakes to the differential without getting any glue on the axle. And at this point I sprayed that Stenolres primer on the rest of the pieces that I told you about, and it kind of helps with adhesion and it'll darken the body color a little bit. Now after the primer dried, I hand painted the engine, transmission, and the rear differential assembly using some flat XF16 and semi-gloss black X18, and then I left the frame in primer because the color was just right. Now glue the differential to the frame, and I grabbed the rear spring assembly from the chrome sprue and glued it to the frame and the rear differential for proper alignment before the glue head set. And once again, remove chrome and paint when you want to glue pieces together. I decided to deviate somewhat from the instructions, and we'll do that through the kit for the purposes of finishing. And so I wanted to finish up the frame, and I removed the imperfections from these rear suspension parts and the front parts, along with the exhaust pipes, gas tanks, and the drive line. And then I glued the 4-point link to the rear springs and the frame rails. And while that was drying, I worked on the front suspension by gluing the spring to the upper A-arm, and then I glued the A-arm to the spring while holding the spindle in between the A-arms. Now don't get glue on spindles if you want the front wheels to be posable. These parts are pretty fragile and flimsy, so when I started to hold them, you have to glue them to the frame assembly. And while that dries, I painted the gas tank and the drive line flat aluminum. Now glue the center link to the rear differential and the rear 4-point link. Now glue the gas tank to the body cross members, and then the drive line to the rear differential, and slide the engine assembly into the frame and the drive line and glue the parts into place. Finally, the instructions show you gluing the exhaust pipes in, but I wanted to wait until the heads and exhaust manifolds were in place so that I could glue the pipes to the manifolds on the engine and to the body cross member in the correct position. And get the parts out now for the wheel assemblies, and be careful not to damage the plated parts by trimming them too close from the sprue. If you need to touch them up, a chrome pen works well. Now remove the plating from the glue points on the rims and put the tire halves together, and then glue the rim halves together over the tire halves. Now these old tires are somewhat deformed, so I took the two halves and then I used some super glue on them, and after that it had set, I ran the tread across some 80 grit sandpaper until the flash was removed and kind of looked like a scuffed surface on the tread area. So give the rims a coat of Tamiya black panel line wash when they're assembled, and then it says to put them onto the frame at this point, but they're kind of finicky and flimsy, so I'm going to do that later on. The orange pins that you see, they get poked through the spindles on the front end so that the tires can spin. And now we can work some of the related parts here: the engine manifolds, the fenders, the front end of the engine and the radiator, etc. And we're going to clean those up. Any parting lines or any ejector pin marks that you want to not be visible. So go ahead and do that for those parts, and get out the valve covers and the radiator shroud and the lower radiator hose as well. Now glue the exhaust manifolds and the valve covers to the heads, and glue the battery box to the fenders. And I did that before I painted it with primer to make sure that it was glued well. Now paint the head assemblies semi-gloss black and dry brush the highlights with some flat aluminum. While the paint's drying, glue the fan and the alternator to the belts, and paint the belts and the fan flat black. Now the instructions have you glue the fenders to the frame now, but I wanted to paint the fenders and the body at the same time. So I test fitted the fenders over the engine and decided I could place the head assembly onto the engine before gluing the fenders in place. Now glue the radiator into the radiator housing and paint the radiator and hose flat black and give the front of the housing a black wash. Now I decided to glue the intake manifold and distributor, and then I painted the distributor flat black. To add some realism to my model, I decided to wire the engine, so I used some soft lead wire from an online fishing tackle store. And this was size 0.01, so 1/10 for the ignition wires. I cut the plug wires to length and glued them from the distributor to the plugs where they're located. And I used a Mustang shop manual to get the firing order correct. So you can also find the firing order for most engines online. Now using a piece of sprue, I made a coil and glued it to the near the water pump and painted it black with a yellow top, and then placed a wire from the distributor to the coil. Finally, I painted the wires blue. Next, get out the body, the fenders, hood, side curtains, the dashboard, headlights, and the buckets. And then glue the body to the fenders and the hood curtains to the side of the hood. And this is done before the primer got sprayed on. Now the primer coat looked good, so I used an airbrush with some Tamiya X6 orange and a drop of brown to deepen the orange, and painted the body, the hood, the dashboard, and the headlight buckets. And after the paint had dried, I glued the body assembly to the frame. Look for the mounting points and remove any paint from where you're going to glue. After the body attachment was dry, I glued the fan and the belt assembly to the engine. Then I painted the power steering pump semi-gloss black and glued it to the belt assembly. Next we can work on the interior, so get the tub out and the parts for the seats, and then glue the seats and the seat backs together and clean them all up of any imperfections. And then I gave them a coat of that primer, and after that had dried, I used my airbrush to paint the seats and tub a coat of brown XF10 paint. And then while that was drying, I glued the radiator and hoses to the engine frame and the body assembly, and I set the hood in to ensure the proper alignment of the radiator. And now that the interior is dry, paint the centers of the seats flat earth XF52, and then grab the handbrake from the chrome tree and paint the handle flat black along with the gas and the brake pedals. Now glue those into place, and glue the interior into place in the body, and finally glue the front seats into position. And note there's battery access there. When I turned the unit over after it was dried, I noticed I'd forgotten something. The rack and pinion was still in the chrome tree. So a good modeler will figure out a way to fix things. So I wedged the rack and the pinion between the frame and the attachment point on the spindle, which holds it in place without glue and keeps the steering posable. And so then I slid the steering column through the interior and into the rack and pinion and glued it to the frame only. Now give the suspension parts a little black wash, and they should still work. So grab the pieces for the convertible top and then assemble that and primer it. And there was a little gap at the glue line on the top, so I used some spot putty to fill the gap and smoothed it over before coating it with primer again and painting it flat earth XF52. When the paint has dried, you can go ahead and place the window glass into the rear window using some white glue or some clear part cement. Next, grab the steering wheel, steering column, controls, the dash, carburetor halves, and the air cleaner, and remove any imperfections from them. And then glue the carburetor halves together and the air cleaner to the carburetor. And then paint the assembly semi-gloss black and glue it to the intake manifold there. Now, dry brush the air cleaner and the power steering reservoir highlights with some flat aluminum. I grabbed the previously painted headlight buckets, and now I glued them to the headlights and the mounting frame, and then glued that to the holes in the fenders. Next, grab that dashboard and paint the instruments black and highlight the bezels with a chrome pen. After that dries, slide the dash over the steering column and glue it into the body. And now slide the controls on the steering column and glue them into place. Glue the steering wheel to the column and paint that steering wheel flat earth, and next paint the running boards a rubber black color. Now you can use some Testors parts cement or clear glue and install the front glass into the windshield frame. Then paint the round side mirrors with a chrome pen and glue the interior rear view mirror to the frame and the front glass. Now glue the windshield assembly onto the body. Now get the wheels out and glue the rear wheels to the rear axles and the push pins through the spindles on the frame there to glue the wheels to the pins only so that the wheels will continue to spin. Now glue the license plate and the tail light, paint the tail light a clear red and glue the assembly to the rear fender. And now use some warm water to place the 4 decals onto the model, and take care placing the long side stripes, making sure that the hood is firmly in place, and use a setting solution to get the decals to conform to the panel lines. When the side stripes are all set, cut along the hood so that it can be removed, and give all the parts a shiny coat of Pledge floor gloss, and then the floor gloss will in some cases dull some of the detail in the window etching, so maybe skip coating the clear parts to keep the etching nice and crisp. So there you have it. Your model is complete, and this stunning example of a street rod from the old school is something that you'd be proud to put away. But the kit is a little bit difficult. I would not recommend it for the beginner. The suspension's a little tricky to put together, especially if you want the features to work. Not to mention, they don't talk about the rack and pinion assembly in the instructions. And that being said, I was concerned about the old decals as well, and the long ones worked well, but the one in the back, the rear decal, cracked in the middle, but I was able to piece it into position. Overall, it's a nice kit, and it lends itself to some really nice detailing. You could even update the tires and things of that nature. And I was surprised that I hadn't seen it in a very long time, but they are still available on the market and mostly on auction sites. So if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf.